Welcome to my podcast. This is Julia Topaz, astrologer and author of the book Astrolograph. So today I want to talk about a subject that I think has anyone on a chokehold, truly, Pluto. Pluto is such an interesting planet for so many reasons. We'll talk about Pluto transits specifically today, but I do want to do a little bit of a recap on Pluto energy. Pluto in astrology is, in my opinion, the most loaded planet. Represents the concept of death and rebirth. So very lighthearted subjects. It represents the unknown, darkness, the subconscious, which, if you think about it, are all the same thing. It represents power and powerlessness, addictions and compulsions. I like to explain Pluto to my clients in the following terms. So Pluto represents what is unknown, therefore is in the dark, and therefore can make us powerless or in danger. If you don't know what lurks in the dark, that one thing can destroy you, it can kill you. The moment you shine light on what is in the dark, it is therefore in the light. By definition, Pluto represents the concept of death and rebirth and transformation. Shining light on what is hidden, by essence, makes it known and makes it transformed. So Pluto is truly the concept of subconscious and consciousness, and how do you transform what is unconscious into consciousness by shining light and awareness on it. Pluto can be a very dark, heavy planet, but it can also be one of the most majestic, insightful, powerful planet, depending on if you're operating from the unknown and the dark and the hidden, or if you go into the light and the transmutation and the rebirth process. So, Pluto transits. So what are transits, right? Maybe we should start with this, but I'm assuming if you're listening to this episode, you might know. And so transit represent what you are going through at any point in time. So transits represent what kind of events are you going to attract at a certain point in time? What kind of events are you going to manifest? And what are the changes that you're going through internally? And what are the lessons that you're learning? And in what frequency are you? In what cycle are you at any given point in time? Pluto transits the most, I want to say, clickbait transits. On my website, I have 2 blog posts actually about transit Pluto to Moon, and those are by far the most researched and read and clicked on posts, simply because I think Pluto transits are just so difficult to go through that people are like, what is happening to me? And I need someone to explain to me what to do very slowly and in details. So yeah, those are Pluto transits. Now, what does the theory says that Pluto transits are about, right? So if you go on Google and you type Pluto transit, you will find a lot of literature about how Pluto transits are about death and rebirth, letting go, destruction of some part of your life, purging, empowerment, situations that are compulsive and that you can't prevent from happening. And to be honest, all of those interpretations are true. I would just simply approach this subject in a slightly different manner. I just don't like when interpretations make you feel like you have no choice or you're just suffering through a period of time. Might be my Sag rising speaking, or maybe my Virgo Venus who wants to help. I like to frame things in a way that give you a sense of, okay, I can do something about this, or I can work on this, or this makes sense. And luckily for anyone listening, I did go through Pluto square 4 of my Libra planets. So I would say I'm fairly well versed in Pluto transits. So the way I would personally describe Pluto transits is they represent being at a point in time where you are being forced, whether you want it or not, to face shadow sides of your personality. I don't know if you're familiar with the shadow. We all have a lot of elements in our personality that are conscious, things that we know about ourselves, that are information that is accessible. And then we all have dark corners, right? Emotions that we might have repressed, desires that we might have repressed, trait in our personality that are maybe a little darker. And usually, in order to maintain a coherent narrative about who we are as people, those darker sides of our personality tend to be tucked away, obviously not consciously. This is the whole point of Pluto. And the more Pluto aspects you have in your birth chart, the more likely that this is happening for you. If you do not have any aspects of Pluto in your birth chart, you might very well be someone who doesn't have a strong shadow. And then the more Pluto transit, the more likely it is that this is actually happening. And so when we have transits of Pluto, and I want to say for any transit, hey, like even a trine or even a sextile, but usually the most difficult are the square and the conjunction and the opposition, because usually the way this is happening is through conflict and through challenges and internal turmoil and etc. With Pluto transits, you are, in one way or another, which once again the aspect would determine, you are being called by your own soul, by your own journey, to discover shadow sides of your personality that are there, but not necessarily conscious. And so usually we will attract situations and people who reflect our own repressed darkness. And so you will find people saying, oh, a Pluto transit, Pluto square your Venus means that you will find someone, you will meet a romantic partner who is super toxic and unhealthy. Okay, awesome, but you're diagnosing the symptom, not the cause. Meeting someone who's unhealthy is the symptom of your repressed shadow, and the whole point of this transit is to invite you to see it. Now, bear in mind, in my opinion, transits cannot force you to do anything. People can go through Pluto transits and attract all types of situations that are quite painful, and it is up to you and your willingness and your level of consciousness to learn the lesson. Some people go through plenty of Pluto transits and they haven't learned much about their shadow. I do think that there is a part of free will that comes into transits. But in my opinion, this is what Pluto transits are about. And it's not always about discovering. When we talk about the shadow and darkness, I feel like my mind immediately goes to like darker qualities. Oh, maybe I am envious and I didn't know it. Or maybe I am manipulative and I didn't know it. But darkness can also be much softer qualities, and that does happen quite often. For example, a Pluto transit might make you realize that you've been suppressing your own anger for the sake of people pleasing, and it's time for you to stop doing that. Or it might be that you realize that you haven't been able to set boundaries for yourself, and it's a time of empowerment for you and reclaiming that side of you that is allowed to prioritize oneself and one's well-being. But I will say that this is truly what a Pluto transit, in my opinion, is about. And I also want to add a detail. I am not of the belief that anything that happens to us is something that we manifested or attracted. I do think that a lot of things that happen are indeed like things that are currently matching our frequency, matching our desires. I do think that, but not everything. Some things are random, some things are not part of our soul contract, some things are not things that you would have control over. And I think it's quite dangerous to say the opposite. Like, things happen, accidents happen, not everything is under our control, but a good chunk is. And I think for Pluto transit, this is really the lesson that I would give. whatever you're going through is trying to show you repressed parts of your personality. Now, that being said, I do want to give examples about this, both from my personal experience, because I did go through quite a few, and then obviously like stories from clients and also celebrities. So I do want to illustrate what I'm saying. So for me, my first Pluto transit by square was Pluto square Sun in Libra. And when I had Pluto square Sun, I had just moved to Canada, and so I had no contacts, no experience, nothing. And so I responded to an ad that was for a sales job for a singles club. So I thought, okay, I love sales, I love relationships, so let's do that. And then I started working there, and my boss was probably a sociopath. I had no experience in sales whatsoever, and he trained me to sales, and he was actually training me to high pressure sales with a lot of manipulation and like very deceptive techniques. And I was very young, and once again I knew nothing about nothing, so I stayed at that job for a few months, at which point it just wasn't possible. But I felt like this job was making me discover not only the shadow of society, the things they do to convince people to purchase their products is actually quite concerning and dark, truly. This guy was drunk on power constantly. And then for me, I realized, okay, this is not something I can do. But it was discovering my own darkness, because I did do the job, discovering the darkness of the world around me. And so it was definitely like one of the greatest features for me of this Pluto square Sun. And then I had Pluto square Mercury. This one was slightly different. I became utterly obsessed with psychology. I was already obsessed with astrology, and then during this transit, my obsession only grew. And I think that's really when I became quite an expert, actually, at astrology. But then I became obsessed with Mercury in Libra, mind you. I became obsessed with psychology. And I read so many books about relationships and about communication and just in general. I think that year I read about 25 books on psychology. So when I say I was obsessed, I'm not joking. And I think it was the year where I truly almost deciphered my own brain, where I was like, oh my God, there is so much more to my brain that I cannot see, but now I can see it because now I have the knowledge. And so it was this very empowering moment. I don't think I had anything dark about my own mind. I think it was more the process of understanding what is subconscious. So it was a very interesting year for me. Pluto square my moon, and that one was a different beast. Pluto square my moon truly is the transit that I am the most grateful for in my life, but it's also the one that I really thought was going to break me. Pluto square my moon made me incredibly scared because I thought I was losing my mind. I was just overpowered with waves of emotions that were so intense that it felt they were going to swallow me. Pluto square moon is the first time I experienced a panic attack, and I had no idea what that was. And funny story, I ended up at the hospital and they told me, oh ma'am, you're just having a panic attack, nothing is happening. So that was Pluto moon for me. I ended up being so panicked about random things. I had a landlord that was really threatening at the time and was crazy, to be honest. And I did have a relationship that I wanted to let go but was struggling to. In hindsight, though, I could give you all the reasons why I was panicking, but none of them were actually worth panicking. I think I was just reacting really strongly to things that were happening around me. And then I was just so baffled with how impacted I was by seemingly small things. And so that's the first time I took myself to therapy, and I was like, okay, if you're having panic attack and waking up in the middle of the night feeling like you are suffocating, I think you need help. And so I did go to therapy, and I think I went very regularly for the whole duration of the transit, actually. And who I am today has nothing in common with who I was back then. I just discovered so much emotionally and literally discovered all the shadow sides that I was carrying emotionally. All my fears that I had repressed, all my coping mechanisms that I had repressed, all the needs that I had repressed, all the ways in which I was trying to get my needs met that might not have been very healthy. All of that, just one by one, just discovered and tackled, discovered and tackled. And so then there was Pluto square Mars, my Mars being in Libra. And that was a 2-year window of time where I was really committed to dating men who were quite unhealthy and power driven. In hindsight, what was really interesting about this transit is that it's not that I was attracting men who were unhealthy. It's more, I think on some level, I was almost looking to find my own power. Mars and Libra, we can be quite submissive in weird ways. Like we can be at the same time quite argumentative because Libra, law, justice. But at the same time, we can also be way too appeasing and people pleasers. And I found myself in a relationship with a man who was just so domineering that I would go into fawning mode where I would just do anything to appease him just so that it stops. And then I'd wake up the next day and think to myself, what have I done? Who am I? I'm like, I'm not going to let this man do that to me. Those relationships were fairly brief, but it was wildly impacting. And I think, again, tying it back to what I said about discovering your own shadow through those transits, it wasn't so much about the men. It was more about me and what it was teaching me about my own Mars and Libra and learning how to be in my power in a healthy way, not being aggressive, also not falling and people pleasing or just sacrificing my own needs. So it was very interesting. And then I have so many examples from my clients, but top of my head, this man who was in a relationship that he ended, and he's the one who chose to end it, but he's Moon in Aquarius conjunct Saturn, so if that means anything to you, fairly detached and not so much in touch with his emotions, like quite dismissive of them. And then Pluto conjuncted his Moon, and he said to me, like, I am at the lowest I've ever been. I didn't even know I could experience such intense emotions, and I'm crying myself to sleep. And I was like, yeah, that's Pluto Moon for you. You are just barely scratching the surface of your emotional world. So obviously it was hard for him in the moment, but ultimately it did lead him to entering a loving relationship that is much more intimate and connected because of his newfound ability to relate on that level. A lot of women divorce when Pluto is opposite their sun. Not always for the same reasons. Quite often it's a period of time where they really become so much more empowered and becoming aware of repressed parts of their identity they sacrificed for the sake of the relationship. I would say this is the most common. And again, that sense of discovering repressed parts of your personality. Sometimes if you're not really hiding any skeletons, it's just you becoming deeper with yourself and getting acquainted with shadow parts of your personality. But sometimes it's quite textbook. For example, P. Diddy, the allegations against him that recently surfaced happened during Pluto conjunct his Mars. Mars being sexuality and the masculine principle in general, and then Pluto being the shadow being revealed. So sometimes it's much more intense. It really depends on the choices that you've made. And then I do have a few more examples of Pluto Mars, actually. A client who has been really struggling, a male who has been struggling with career, and he's experienced a sense of being frozen, like being unable to look for a job and at the same time unable to start the business that he wants to start, and just being caught in this immobility of I can't do anything, I can't take any actions. And so his Mars is in Taurus in his birth chart, and so Pluto square his Mars is all about his own shadow side of Mars and Taurus being revealed to him and experiencing that pressure until he implodes or gets into movement. And then this other client that I have, a female, Mars and Taurus, and in her birth chart she has Pluto opposite Mars. So she actually already has a pattern to resolve in her energy about owning her own darkness and her attraction for darkness. And obviously she only dates bad boys and even sometimes criminals, which is very common with Pluto Mars. And for her, the transit of Pluto to Mars was about learning about her own shadow through other people. And the transit presented the betrayal of a business partner who actually stole $100,000 from her and essentially abused her trust. And now she's obviously fighting this and wanting to take this legal. But for her, Pluto square Mars, reproducing Mars opposite Pluto, was showing her shadow and the shadow of the people around her, and how her own choices led her to the situation where she's being betrayed by someone who has no integrity. So yeah, Pluto transits are really, really interesting in that way. And I think there's a lot of value in trying to reclaim the power, reclaim the lesson. In transits of Pluto, they're not just about destruction, they're about being offered the possibility to transmute darkness into light. So yeah, that was our episode today. I hope that this was insightful, and yeah, that it triggered more of your curiosity for Pluto and its transits. And see you in the next episode.